welcome. I'm very glad to be here and meet some colleagues, teachers, students. So it's one of a rare opportunity where all those people meet and can exchange. I was asked to give a speech about the second topic of this conference, the political risk in business. And to be honest, I took as a model the speaker of last year, Elon, and tried to do my best to come up with also an interesting topic like that. For those who don't know me, little bio, I'm a cross-cultural management specialist. I work in universities and also in consulting. Worked on various topics, and usually I work for universities on some topics that are economically related, organizational behavior, management, and so on. Today, however, I want to talk about something a little bit different. And for that, I want to introduce to you, for those who are maybe not familiar with this field, cross-cultural theories. Because usually we use cross-cultural theories for exclusively business-related topics to assist managers in their strategic planning, so exactly what we were hearing before. If you go to St. Petersburg, yes, check the water pipes. They're big. It's because Russia is big also. But also to use new processes, all the guidelines of working in an international environment. We also will find cross-cultural theories in terms of change management, how to introduce new policies. Here I'm thinking in particular about merger and acquisitions, where culture is the #1 barrier for success. All the questions of internalizations. We also will find cross-cultural theories for motivation topics, ethics. I'm here thinking about the ever-spreading topic of diversity, inclusion, which are by definition also linked with this topic. But cross-cultural management can also be used for political risk. Political risk in business. Political risk, it is about business. We should not let you be put off. We're talking here about business. There are several ways of assessing political risk. We can look at it from a strictly political perspective, of course. We can look at it from an economic perspective. We can look at it from a demographic perspective. But I'm a specialist of culture, so I prefer to talk about my trade, culture. Culture is useful precisely to enhance decision-making in business. And that's what I'm going to present to you briefly. First of all, a word about culture itself. Culture is useful for business, for planning decisions, to plan interaction with others. But we don't always understand what culture really is. Probably one of the most influential authority in this field, Geert Hofstede from the Netherlands, presents culture as something that is actually a lot more difficult than we think. Culture is more often a source of conflict than synergy. It's true. Cultural differences are a nuisance at best and often a disaster. So we need to also know our limits. We need to know what we're dealing with. And of course, we could almost actually apply this definition for politics. Source of conflicts and synergy, and nuisance at best and often a disaster. So we can see here there is almost a natural match. So crash course on culture. we look at culture from various aspects. We look at culture sometimes from a purely communication perspective. You all know that, for instance, culture can be about non-verbal communications. And in many international situations, we have some awkward situations, not due to what people are doing, saying, but it's just the way they're standing and what they're doing. All of a sudden, strong interest in the shoes of each other. Non-verbal communication, hand gestures, can be also about artifacts, the way we dress, the way we look. Here's a picture from the APEC summit. Every year the leaders of those countries gather, and there is this a bit strange tradition where they dress in some national outfit. I'm not entirely sure it's helping, but that's one of the characteristics we've got. In one word, culture can be very misunderstood from the perspective we have. Right? So this is actually a big issue when we are talking about business, because the influence of the political sphere in business is gigantic. So what is culture and how can we use it? There are many definitions of culture. My definition is culture, this is how we prefer to solve a problem as a group. Culture, it's a group thing. It can be national, can be corporate, can be sectorial. It's a culture. The way we do things when we are confronted with a problem, a dilemma, a choice. How do we greet the business partners that we meet for the first time? How do we give a gift? How do we say that the price is too high? All those situations, actually, in our own culture, we've got ways to do it. And as soon as we deal with a different culture, it's different. But most important in this definition is how we prefer. Because, of course, there is a big gap between what we prefer to do and what we do. And that's why it's so complicated to do business internationally. Because despite your best preparation, and you're being told, well, people in this country, they prefer to do things that way, you arrive over there, and guess what? They just do something else. Because we are irrational people. We're Homo sapiens, you know? And even if in a group we prefer to do certain things in a certain way, we regularly decide to do things differently because the situation commands it. So it makes it even more complicated when we try to find a way. Essentially, culture, therefore, is about behavior. All the rest is superficial. This is how we prefer to behave, and most of the problems are actually about a lack of understanding about the behavior of the other one. When I'm talking about behaviors, I am talking about behaviors that are expected, but we need to be very careful. We're absolutely not talking about predictive behavior. It is not because one individual comes from this particular culture that, of course, people will behave like that. French do speak foreign languages. Living proof. So the idea here is to analyze the preferred behavior so that we can expect some kind of reaction. Sometimes we're correct, sometimes we're incorrect, but nevertheless, getting the information is a competitive advantage. So, of course, there are plenty of models that have been tried to present those things. We have one of the earlier models from Edward Hall, an American anthropologist, from Geert Hofstede, very famous model. We've got another Dutch, von Strompenaars, with another model too, very colorful. We've got a Globe project, which is an international effort to precisely reconcile all kind of problems of the previous models. We've got Shalom Schwartz, and we've got also some private models done by businesses, some consultings. And Richard Lewis also has its own model. And I even have my own model. See, everyone has a model. So what can we do out of it? Well, probably it's possible to use those methods to try to understand what happened, politically speaking, and in business. However, one warning: those models usually are looking at a profile of a given culture, but it is not because we have the same cultural profile that we are the same. Here, for instance, using the Schwartz model, we can see that China and Poland surprisingly shares the same statistics. Does that mean that Poland and China have the same culture? Obviously not. So we need to be very careful with all those data and statistics and so on, because, well, sometimes we can behave the same way, but for different reasons. That's also important to keep that in mind. Right, so let's have a look at a few examples that where we can use various models as an illustration. And I'll start with a little controversy that happened a couple of months ago between Air France and KLM. Air France, KLM is an airline which is a joint airline between the French and the Dutch. And what happened a few months ago, shocking, the Dutch government decided to buy, in a very quick way, a large amount of stocks of the company. The French were shocked. And here we've got some reaction of the Ministry of Economy of France, who said, oh, the Dutch behavior was relatively the Dutch behavior was relatively unfriendly. It was actually surprising. And, well, a government shouldn't mingle with business. It's the French Minister of Economy who's telling that, of course, which doesn't bother them at all. But here it's very interesting because the source of the problem from the French perspective was not that the Dutch government buys a share of the company. They themselves have the equal share. The problem was the way it was done. The Dutch government did not consult with anyone. They just bought the shares. And for anyone who knows a thing or two about the Dutch culture, this isn't really surprising. For the Dutch, it was business as usual. You know what? Why is it an interesting case? Because if we look at one of those models from Edward Hall, we are talking here about high and low context communication, which basically here is looking at how much background information do you expect the other side to share with you to understand the proper message. In other words, how much indirect or direct are you when you communicate? If you are indirect, it means that the amount of shared information is giving you some understanding. You can see on this scale the Dutch to be almost off the cliff. Usually when we're talking about directness of communication among interculturalists, we often say you've got indirect cultures, direct cultures, and the Dutch. And the Dutch government simply decided one morning to buy the shares. No need for explanation. This is obvious as it is. If the French government had studied a thing or two about the Dutch culture, they should not have been surprised by the way it is being done. Okay? So another example, this one already from a few years, maybe about almost 10 years ago, when Greece was in trouble. Another Dutch interculturalist, von Stroppenhuis, wrote a very interesting text. It was really at the beginning of the crisis. After that, it went from bad to worse. What von Stroppenhuis explained, he really drew a comparison between the Greek political culture and the Eurozone political culture. And using his model, we can see here the near-perfect opposition between those two cultures. The euro is a universal currency that's designed like that. Everyone who's part of the Eurozones has the same currency, the same banknotes. It's built on the same rules, which of course doesn't fit very well with a particularistic mindset like Greece, where people think that their culture is very special. A universal currency implies that there shouldn't be too many exemptions. Exemptions can happen, but here's the main difference is, do we tolerate exceptions, or do we believe exceptions should be exceptional? In Greece, exceptions are a way to do business. It's seen as a normal way. Of course, in Frankfurt at the central bank, we don't look at it this way. Lying about a financial situation can be seen very differently from one cultural aspect to another. Some people are ready to lie to save their face. Others will never lie because they believe that lying is actually profoundly the wrong thing to do. Here we can also look at the way we solve problems. The Eurozone is an organization that is very specific. We solve problems step by step. And the Greeks, of course, don't follow this way of thinking. They've got a lot more holistic view of things and will connect their financial situation with geopolitics and maybe religions and other topics, which for them makes a lot of sense, but is not understood by their other European partners. And finally, the leadership, which is needed for this type of situation. In the Eurozone, it's absolutely clear that we should have an achieved-orientated leader. In other words, some technocrats, some specialists, whereas in Greece at that time, we had the Prime Minister Papandreou, who is part of a political dynasty of politicians who's being elected primarily because of this family background, but not because of technical case. So here, using purely cross-cultural tools, we have the whole Greek crisis presented in front of us. So it is very tempting to create some kind of cultural profiles. Here, for instance, we have the major cross-cultural dimensions. So those are some sort of behavioral units that we are able to analyze, and we can have fun and draw some kind of profiles based upon, again, preferences. All that is subject for discussions. You understand, I'm presenting some orientations that are voluntarily exaggerated, but to show precisely the points where we have a cultural proximity or not. What is very interesting when we use culture and politics is also to realize that if you have a dominant culture somewhere, it of course doesn't mean that everyone in this territory is the same. Obviously not. Lately, the best example comes from the USA, where the current president, Mr. Trump, is culturally very far away from the traditional American culture. We have a culture where, for instance, rather egalitarian, where Mr. Trump is very hierarchical. US is by definition very universalistic, where he's extremely particularistic. We have a specific way of doing things. Mr. Trump is very diffuse. The US usually praise a neutral behavior to emotions. You can't make you can't find someone that is more emotional than Mr. Trump. And other topics like that can be analyzed. This means what? It means that in the US, a lot of people don't necessarily understand what the president is doing for cross-cultural reasons. However, if we add on the profile of the president, with other cultures, we realize that there are quite some proximity with other cultures. Here, for instance, the Russian culture is actually quite close to the personal preference of Mr. Trump. And there is a personal proximity that is obvious. There are also some connection, for instance, with the Chinese culture. So here, we're having a proximity, not culture to culture, but individual to particular culture, which is very useful to know, because then, for instance, it can be used to prepare negotiations. Obviously, when we look at this kind of graph, we understand that Mr. Trump is not very, very comfortable with team discussions. That's not his thing. And so when we've got the G7 meetings or the NATO meetings or any kind of meetings, I mean, it's always a little world catastrophe. However, he's very fond of face-to-face summit. And when two presidents meet, that's usually a meeting, but somehow when Mr. Trump meets another president, it's a summit. Yeah. So we have been changing the format of meetings precisely to match this cultural situation. A few years ago, with some colleagues, I participated in a conference that was actually talking about all the region of Russia and the surrounding. And we looked at the proximity of cultures between Russia, Ukraine, European Union, and the USA. It was very interesting because when you look at it, you realize that Ukraine and Russia, which is not surprising for anyone who knows those cultures, are culturally very similar. And because those two cultures are particularistic, we are very special, because they are very diffuse cultures, where precisely long-term relationship means something, which means that when we break off, then it's terrible. Because those two cultures are externally controlled, we believe that what happens to our life is subject to a lot of external forces. And because both cultures scores rather high in hierarchy, we're having now a very difficult conflict with difficult way out because of cultural issues. If we look at, for instance, the EU in comparison, we realize, and the EU, I just want to be clear, I'm not talking of a so-called European culture. From Finland to Portugal to Estonia to Bulgaria, there is not really much of a European culture, except if we compare with big clusters. But there is a European Union culture. This weekend, there will be European Union elections. They follow certain rules, and this means there is a culture. European Union is very universalistic. No exceptions. Ask the Greek. The European Union is quite egalitarian. Despite what a lot of political parties claim, everybody is pretty equal at the summit of heads of states. If one president wants to bar one decision, often it's possible. European Union, emotionally speaking, is quite calm. And here I'm very, very, it's a euphemism. There's no emotion in EU. We're talking of a low context orientated culture, precisely where we don't have much in emotions. And it's very inward control. We rarely hear EU summits blaming problems of EU to external forces. This leads to a very strong misunderstanding between Russia and the EU, where precisely we're ending up with two cultures that don't understand each other. And here, working on both sides, I'm constantly fascinated by the fact that the European Union doesn't know how to deal with Russia, although it's been there for a long time. And somehow each time there is a problem, the EU always seems to be surprised at how Russia is behaving and reacting. Equally surprising, Russia doesn't seem to really understand how the European Union is functioning. And so having a look at those cultural profiles helps a little bit. Another example, Brexit, of course. You thought you would escape it? No, it's going to haunt us for a long, long time. When we look at the British profile, this is again another model, we realize several things. The British are known for their competitive behavior. And we heard Theresa May regularly saying, we're not going to let the other ones decide. UK is a culture that prefers order in organization. And this has become a buzzword. We want to live in an orderly fashion. We're talking of a culture with an inductive thinking, which means that we will pay attention to the facts before the theory. We're having a linear thinking, and that's why from the beginning we keep talking about contract, we keep talking about deals that are step by step. There is no holistic, let's get around one table and let's make a deal. I mean, if Brexit was negotiated between, for instance, the USA and Russia, they would be solved a long time ago, of course. But that's between UK and EU. Culturally speaking, we're stuck. We've got also a preference for formality, and we have a preference for universalism. It means when people vote, whether we like it or not, we stick to it. And from the beginning of the Brexit, if you look at the UK culture, it's absolutely clear that the UK government is going to go all the way, even if it hurts, to respect the choice of the people. Would have been French situation, the French would have probably found a deal not to have the Brexit on, because of cultural reasons. So as you can see, it's interesting to have a look at this thing. Another curious example, the relationship between Russia and Turkey, for instance, where the two cultures are surprisingly similar on many aspects. Assertiveness, humane orientation, in-group collectivism, power distance, uncertainty avoidance. The only case where the countries are very different is in institutional collectivism. That's very different from Turkey to Russia, with Russia scoring very low on institutional collectivism, contrary to intuitive thinking. So here we are dealing with two cultures that have a lot of points in common, and which show also that despite all kind of announcements in the news, culturally speaking, those countries have a lot in common, and the two leaders get along pretty well, despite a reality that could tell otherwise. So here we find also some answers. Finally, using a Lewis model, it's interesting to see how countries are positioned on this kind of map. Surprisingly, we see that a lot of countries are on the left side, especially when we look at the countries that are part of the Security Council in the United Nations, opposed to China, and I added Iran because it's a lot in the news lately. This, of course, doesn't mean that countries that have cultural distance don't get along. It just shows the cultural challenges that are leading ahead between certain countries. You see the proximity between UK and the US, or for instance, France and Russia, and China and Iran, who are positioned culturally very far away. So this was a short overview of how we can use cross-culture to assess the political risk in business. A couple of quotes to conclude. One very academic from Edward Hall, who, famous anthropologist, who said, "Culture is dictatorial unless understood and examined." And couple of days before elections, I think it's important to remind that if we idealize culture, we tend to turn into a dictatorial. Or if we want to be more business-orientated, I'm going to use the words of a famous investor, Peter Thiel, who explained Airbnb, don't fuck up the culture when you do some business. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any questions?
No questions.
No questions?
I'm sorry. Jerome, thank you very much.